All right. My name is Bill Scher. I am the Vice President of the Calvin Coolidge Presidential Library and Museum Standing Committee, which is a very mouthful of a title. I really appreciate all you coming. I appreciate partnering with CBI on this. This might be one of the biggest crowds we've ever had for any Coolidge event, which I'm sure is all CBI and not us. You should sit. I'll do proper introductions of them in a second. But I just wanted to know this is part of our Coolidge Centennial series. It was 100 years in 1923. In 2023 was 100 years of Coolidge becoming president, and there's lots of 100-year anniversaries to do over the course of this presidency. And 2025 marks the 100th anniversary of Coolidge's speech at a dedication ceremony for a Jewish community center in Washington, D.C., which made him the first president to speak at the dedication of a Jewish community institution that was not a house of worship. I'm going to read a little bit of that speech in a second, but just do a little bit of other Coolidge Museum housekeeping. One, we are in the middle of a fundraising campaign to renovate the museum, make it far more accessible and illuminating. And so, Cynthia, where can I direct them to make donations?
Forbes Library, if you want to send a check, or you can go online to our website and make a donation as you wish. It's really about, as Phil says, illuminating the Coolidge story from Vermont to Northampton, where he began his political career, to the State House in Boston and to Washington. But we have plans that you can see here, and hopefully please join us.
Thank you very much. We also, I run, I moderate a monthly presidential book club through the Coolidge Museum. We meet in the museum typically fourth Monday every month. We are meeting tomorrow. We go in order. We read a biography of every president in order. So tomorrow actually are consolidating Grover Cleveland and Benjamin Harrison. And so even if you haven't read it, if you want to come tomorrow in the Coolidge Museum at Forbes at 6:30 p.m. just to hear the discussion. It's also virtual. There's a way if you want to get on our email list and get those links, you can do it on Zoom. And we are kind of getting up to Coolidge, and the period from Teddy Roosevelt to Coolidge is really interesting. So it's not. So don't feel like you're missing out by starting in the middle. You're really gonna get into some good stuff very soon. And the last thing I'd say about our Centennial series is that I think it's an opportunity to connect a lot of what happened 100 years ago to today in ways that you might not really think about when you think about Coolidge. So we did one event that was actually pre-centennial about Coolidge and African American civil rights, and we've since done panels on his ascension to the presidency and that transition, which also got into the Teapot Dome scandal. We did one on Native American citizenship and civil rights, and another on immigration. So there's a lot of hot button, controversial, consequential things that you can tie to things happening in society today. And hopefully today, in talking about Coolidge and the Jewish community, is going to also be in that vein. So the ones we've done in the past, you can access on the Forbes Library YouTube, so you can still check those out. So just before I introduce our illustrious panelists, I just want to read a little bit from the speech itself, just to give you a flavor of what we're talking about here. So he said that one of the facts, so the speech was titled Spiritual Unification of America. So it's talking about religious tolerance and religious diversity. He said, one of the factors which I think weighed heaviest on the side of unity, the Bible was the one work of literature that was common to all of them in the colonies, pre-revolution. I remember to have read somewhere, I think in the writings of the historian Lecky, the observation that Hebraic mortar cemented the foundations of American democracy. He talked about the debt which the young American nation owed to the sacred writing that the Hebrew people gave to the world. He cited codes from the 17th century in Connecticut and New Haven that are directly tied to the Old Testament. And that in New Haven, John Davenport arranged that in the first public school in New Haven, the Hebrew language should be taught, because the conviction of the Hebrew language and literature ought to be made as familiar as possible to all people. Talk about the ties of Jewish people to the Revolution. He said that the colonists in general, they knew the book, they were profoundly familiar with it, and eminently capable in the exposition of all of its justifications for rebellion. To them, the record of the Exodus from Egypt was indeed an inspired precedent. And the Jews themselves, of whom a considerable number were already scattered throughout the colonies, were true to the teachings of their own prophets. The Jewish faith is predominantly the faith of liberty. From the beginnings of the conflict between the colonies and the mother country, they were overwhelmingly on the side of the rising revolution. And he told the story of Haim Solomon, Polish Jew financier of the revolution. Born in Poland, he was made prisoner by the British forces in New York, and when he escaped, set up business in Philadelphia. He negotiated for Robert Morris all the loans raised in France and Holland, pledged his personal faith and fortune for enormous amounts, and personally advanced large sums to such men as James Madison, Thomas Jefferson, Baron Steuben, General St. Clair, and many other patriot leaders who testified that without his aid they could not have carried on the cause. That just gives you a sense of what he was saying 100 years ago. And so we're going to have some initial reflections from our panelists. I'll do a little bit of Q&A, and then we'll open up to the full group. So we have on my far right here, Aaron Berman, retired professor of history from Hampshire College, taught history for many years and also served 11 years as the dean of faculty and Vice President for Academic Affairs. He is the author of the new book, America's Arab Nationalists, From the Ottoman Revolution to the Rise of Hitler. And he's also the author of Nazism, the Jews, and American Zionism, 1933 to 1948. And we also have on my near right, Jennifer Young, the Education Program Manager of the Yiddish Book Center. She served as the Director of Education at the YIVO Institute, where she also worked as the Digital Learning Curator to produce YIVO's first online class. And she's also worked at the Tenement Museum, the Lower East Side Jewish Conservancy, and the New York Historical Society. So thank you both for being here. And why don't you kick us off, Aaron?
Okay, can I move back a little bit just because the sun is glares?
No, we're going to ask you to move so we're with the mic.
Okay.
Not that.
I'll bring it up.
You're saying change seats.
Well, I can bring it.
Yeah.
Okay, you have to switch with me.
That's fine. I learned as an administrator and just a faculty member, I learned everything I know from Panina, so if she tells me to do something.
Can we move
try
this
to
out
do
of
it.
the way?
Whoops.
Can I move this out of the way?
Whoops. That okay? Great. So I want to thank everyone for inviting me today and for coming. And I was telling Jennifer just before we started that if you were a PhD student and you walked into your supervisor's office and said you wanted to do your PhD dissertation on Coolidge and the Jews, when they stopped laughing, they would probably call the mental health services at the university. It's not exactly the richest topic. And when I was first asked, I was wondering what I would talk about. But then I read the 1925 address that Bill was mentioning, which I confess I had never read before, and was surprised by how relevant it was to our own times. I'm actually like a historian of nationalism. And you know, the thing about nationalism, one of its characteristics is it both unites and it divides, right? By its very nature, it creates an us and a them. And you know, my understanding of nationalism was very much shaped by the historian Hans Kohn, who lived in Northampton. He was born in the Austro-Hungarian Empire before World War I. He emigrated to Palestine right after the war, where he was involved in the early binationalist movement. He left Palestine partly because he was, let's just say, unhappy by the way things were developing. And he ended up teaching history at Smith College, where in 1944 he wrote his masterpiece book called The Idea of Nationalism, where he said, you know, the kernel of nationalism is an idea. And my elaboration on that is, when I used to teach this, I would tell students, you know, if you're a nationalism, there's a story you tell, there's a narrative. There has to be a narrative that explains why we're a nation, right? Why this group of people who are somehow being united and differentiated from another group, what is it that unites them? And the thing about that story is that it's always there's always contestation, it's always contested, right? There are always varying different versions of the stories, and in some periods, they can be vastly different, right, in terms of who's included and who's excluded. So again, roughly in this time period, right, roughly in the Coolidge era, the Ku Klux Klan is marching through Washington, D.C. in robes and everything else, but carrying American flags, right? Not that long after all this, at least in historical terms, in 1939, Marian Anderson, who was denied access to give a concert at Constitution Hall in Philadelphia, Eleanor Roosevelt arranges for her to give a concert at the Lincoln Memorial, where she's introduced by Harold Ickes, the Secretary of the Interior, and she sings "My Country 'Tis of Thee." And you can watch, you can see, you can find this on YouTube. It's really interesting because it really brings up visions of the 1963 March on Washington. And both in 25 when Coolidge gave this address, and today, you know, we're engaged in a struggle to define what's American, right? And to determine who's included and excluded, right? The whole attack on birthright citizenship, right, is an attempt to sort of redefine who's really American, who's really not. The attack on DEI, right, is the same thing, right? So we see very much today there's this contestation about who is and who isn't. And we see American Jews today, particularly younger American Jews, there's also a debate developing about the role of Israel and Zionism in defining Jewish identity, right? And this was very much the case in 1925, both for Americans and for Jews. You know, if you looked at America in 25, this was the heyday of eugenics, which eugenics is kind of, now we would say the pseudoscience of race. Except by race, they don't mean usually what we define as race today. Today, you know, they tend to think of race as black, white, right? They used race the way we would use ethnicity, right? So there's a German race, there's a Hungarian race, there's a Jewish race, but it's not exactly a synonym for ethnicity, right? They are thinking in terms of blood, right? That there's a specific kind of German blood or a specific kind of Jewish blood, and that somehow biologically you're determined to be who you are, right? And that there are differences between all these races, right? This is the heyday of that. It's the heyday of the Ku Klux Klan. It's, the Red Scare has just ended, and I'm sure this will come up in the question and answer period, and Jennifer will probably talk about it, but one of the bills that Calvin Coolidge signs is the National Origins Act of 1924, which remains on the books until 1965, and is explicitly designed to be a race. It's based upon this pseudo-racial science. It, first of all, puts a cap on the total number of European immigrants let in every year, okay, which is much lower than the total number that had been coming in prior to that, and especially prior to World War I. But it also is based on the notion that America was normal in 1890, meaning, in their terms, racially normal, right? And that what the bill did is exactly based on the name, national origins. It looked at the census of 1890, determined the national origins of Americans in 1890, which again is before, or it's the massive wave of Italian, Jewish, East European immigrants comes in, and bases a quota system for immigration based on that, right? So from the point of view of people who want to restrict immigration, which should sound familiar to us today, right, the beauty of the 1924 National Origins Act is it gives the biggest quotas to places where no one wants to leave, right? And it gives the smallest quotas to places that people are desperate to get out of, right? So Coolidge signs that bill. And for Jews in this period too, I know a lot of you know a lot about this, 1925 worldwide, but even in the United States, the whole issue of Zionism is debated, right? Zionism is one of several movements that exist in terms of trying to chart a Jewish future. There's assimilationism, there's the Jewish Bund. All of this is alive, those debates, again, which I'm happy to talk about in the question and answer period. But Hoover's speech, I know I keep calling him Hoover, which is, but Coolidge, Hoover in some ways is more interesting, but Coolidge, in his speech, it's really interesting because in a way, it's really interesting to see who he includes and he excludes. And as Bill was saying, on one hand, he talks about Jews as a religion, right? That's pretty much how he defines them. But if you read the speech really carefully, you see in various places he slips, and all of a sudden they're called a people. In other places, they're called a race, right? So, it's ambiguous a little bit what he means. And again, as Bill was saying, overall the theme is about religious tolerance, right? But it's clear that his notion of American is somehow limited, right? Because of all the Jews he mentions, as Bill again was saying, right? They're all, as far as I could identify them, they were all Jews who were either here at the time of the Revolution or shortly after, which meant that they came from the very elite, very, very early Sephardic, very small Jewish migration to the United States at the origins of the United States, or to the smaller immigration wave of the early 19th century of Jews from Central Europe and Germany. There's no mention that I could see of any East European Jew who was coming in the recent immigration wave. So you can read that as, again, they're not quite included, right? And I'll just end with this. The 1924 Act has profound impact on Jews. First of all, historians, I think, are pretty united in that Jews were a particular target of this bill, East European Jews. And the other thing is where the unintended consequence of this is when Hitler comes to power and Jews want to get out, that bill is like written in stone, right? And it dooms a lot of people to a really sad fate. Not only Jews, but it has huge implications. So I'll end there and turn it over to Jennifer. Thank you. Get around.
All right, since I'm an educator, and I'm at the Yiddish Book Center, I'm gonna hand out some Yiddish primary sources. Now, with this amazing turnout, I don't have enough for everyone, but I'll put two per table, so you can all have a sense of what it is I'm sharing with you today. And
I can pass that if you want.
there should be two per table, I think. Yeah. All right, how's this for sound? Great. So thank you so much, Bill, and thank you so much, Aaron, for setting up such an amazing event and for really getting into some of the bigger issues here. And to think, what I'm going to do with my time is to think a little bit about the masses of Eastern European Jewish immigrants in the United States and their relationship to Coolidge, which was not something I had thought about prior to chatting with Bill and Aaron when we were planning this event. And so I said, okay, well, why don't I look at what Yiddish newspapers had to say about Coolidge? And, when you go into these kinds of research questions, you start with a hypothesis. And so my hypothesis was that the Yiddish press would be very critical of Coolidge because of the Quota Act in 24. And I found way less of that than I expected, actually. It felt like that was, I went through major headlines in various newspapers, And I went through then political cartoons, because that's a good way to get the sense of what people are saying and talking about in editorials without having to read a million editorials. And I really didn't find any. And instead what I found was represented by what I'm handing out here today. And so to me, I think that looking at newspapers is a really good way of thinking about nationalism, about what Benedict Anderson called imagined community, and how that can be understood through newspapers and particularly through immigrant newspapers in places like the United States. And Yiddish newspapers actually are an example par excellence of this kind of phenomenon and of this research, because Yiddish newspapers became the most successful foreign language newspaper market in the United States at the time that Coolidge was president. So we have this wave of immigration that begins in the 1890s and of course tapers off in the 1920s, by the 1920s. And so we have this huge millions and millions of Eastern European Jewish people living in the United States, many living in New York. And there were at one point 6 daily Yiddish newspapers published in New York City. And so you can imagine that they range from Orthodox, conservative, anarchist, socialist, communist. There's a scholar of Yiddish newspapers at the University of Hartford, Ayala Brin, and she wrote, "If you were a Yiddish-speaking farmer, housewife, theater-goer, humor lover, Zionist, or Marxist, you could find a Yiddish periodical meant for you," published in New York at this time. And in fact, the paper that most of you may have heard of, which was the Yiddish Daily Vorwärts. Who here had relatives that read the Vorwärts? Okay, so this was a small s socialist newspaper, pro-union, published still until very, very recently. Now it's online in Yiddish and in English. It was started in 1897 on the Lower East Side. By the 1920s, at its peak, it had the highest circulation of any foreign language newspaper in the United States. And in fact, it beat the New York Times for readership at its peak. It had over 200,000 readers in the mid-1920s, beating the New York Times. So that gives you a sense of, when I'm looking at these articles with you, like what the imagined community is, what the readership of these newspapers is, how that's reflecting voting patterns, demographics, everything else. And one thing that Yiddish newspapers did was try to cultivate a very kind of intimate relationship with readers. And so there was this sense of like, you could write to the newspaper, you could get your editorial published, you could have this kind of, the editors tried to have this like back and forth relationship with the readers. And what I have in front of you here is this article, or sorry, it's a humor piece, which is sort of playing with this idea of Yiddish readers and editors and audiences having this sort of like civic relationship, not only within this imagined community of the newspaper, but to actual people in power like the president. And this piece was written in January 1926. It was written by Beis Kovner, which was the pseudonym of Yankov Adler, who was a really, really famous Yiddish humorist. And so he writes this humor piece, and everyone in the newspaper will understand the context of it. So he says, "Fischl David der Malamed zum President Coolidge." So Fischl David, what's a Malamed? A teacher. So in this case, he's a Dardeki Malamed, which is a preschool teacher or a kindergarten teacher of small children of Jewish subjects. So that already puts him as like a very humble person, only with a very minimum Jewish education, who's probably very poor. And so you already get this sense of inverted like relationships, right? So who is he to write to President Coolidge? But in the Yiddish newspaper, anyone could talk to anyone else, and you could talk to people in power. And it's sort of like, if you know in the Tevye stories, like Tevye is always talking to God, right? And so you have this sense of like, who am I? I'm just a humble dairyman, but I have this relationship with the divine. Well, Fischl Malamed has this imagined relationship with Coolidge, right? And so when I was reading this article, I was trying to parse out the context. I didn't really understand it all, so I'm just going to give you like the very, very brief version, which is that there was a big miners' strike in Pennsylvania, and that's the context of this article. Coolidge had been dogged by striking miners since 1923. He's clashing with Gifford Pinchot, who at this time is the governor of Pennsylvania, who has bigger political ambitions. And because there's a strike in this anthracite coal mining region, there's no coal going to the rest of the United States. And coal prices are really, really high. So that's the context here, is that, so even poor Fischel David in New York City, who doesn't really understand the larger context of the presidency and of, you know, the Coolidge prosperity, or of the complicated dynamics of miners' unions and the politicians involved in the strike, he has a position on the strike based on his own subjective experience of the strike, which is that he's freezing cold all the time. And so he's writing to President Coolidge in the nicest possible way to try and urge him to do something, to intervene in the strike. And this was apparently quite a ploy used by the Democratic Party at this time, who were trying to blame Coolidge personally for the strike and for the rising price of coal, and urged him to step in to intervene. And that's the subject of this letter, please intervene in the coal strike. Coolidge actually doesn't intervene in the strike. And so this was published in January 26th. The strike is over by early February 1926, and it's settled more internally and not with a presidential intervention. Okay, so to give you a sense of this document, this is a very brief, off-the-cuff translation, but respected President of America, Mr. Coolidge, I, Fischel David, the Dardeke Melamed, of 888 Pitt Street, that's the Lower East Side, write to you this letter. I know that you don't know who I am. How should you know? You read no Yiddish newspaper. And you are no Galicianer, which is part of Poland where he's from. So, you know, they're not neighbors. They don't have people in common, right? So from where should you know me? Let me tell you, I have written letters to Wilhelm of Germany, to Nikolai of Russia, to Franz Joseph of Austria, and to President Wilson. And I said in those letters that they should stop fooling around with war. That why make war to kill people when people die so easily without war? The world proved me correct. Now I write to you, and I'm sure that I will also be correct. So hear me out. As you know, the striking coal miners have been striking for 6 months, and what they want is 20 cents more per ton of coal. So why not give it to them? For example, take me. I'm suffering from the colds. The breath that comes out of my mouth freezes when it hits the cold air. Luckily, I'm not so healthy, so my fever keeps me warm. But not every person has my luck. So Fischel David goes on to describe the plight of the miners stuck underground in the dark, and compares it to Coolidge in the White House, who has servants and warm fires and plenty to eat and drink. And he says, why, this is the socialism of the forwards coming through, right? Why should workers have the good life? Like rhetorically inquires Fischel David. After all, workers make the country rich. If not for the workers, America wouldn't be America. And then he ends again, sort of closing in this sort of like intimate note. He says, you know, like as if he was writing to a close relative. He says, I don't have much more news to write. I'm just a humble subject of yours who hopes that you can step in and end the strike, get the strikers what they demand. It's not much. My wife Chayet Gittel sends greetings, and so does my brother Gedalia, and my landsman Aralai B'Shoichet. He sends greetings too. Sincerely, Fischel David of Pitt Street. So you get this delightful sense of how, even in the pages of the newspaper, and like, you know, obviously Fischel David's not a real person, but there's this sense of like the individual has this relationship to structures of power, and that he's, you know, this character could sort of say like, please do something, you know, if it's not too much to ask, you know, it's really cold down here, you know, please end the strike. And so this idea that like for the, you know, in this kind of piece in the Forverts, Coolidge is in some ways kind of a father figure, and so people can write to him and have this relationship and say, please, if it's not too much trouble, like could you intervene in the strike? And then just briefly to close off for now, I'll just invite you to look at the next page. And so this is the communist newspaper, the Freiheit, and they have a couple of different cartoons here talking about Coolidge in a different light. The word up top here is prosperity, right? This is a byword or catchphrase of the Coolidge regime. Coolidge prosperity. There was a lot of prosperity, but there were also, this was the rise of industrial unionism. There were a lot of strikes, and so there was a lot of sense of like just trying to sort of poke a hole in that bubble, like really using satire, not to be so gentle, but to really try to use it as a weapon to critique the sources of power a little bit more. And in this image here, can anyone read what's written on the bottom, this caption here? Anyone who feels a little bit confident in their Yiddish or their Hebrew? Yeah, where it says Congress. It starts with saying Congress. Anyone? What are you getting a sense of here? What's going on here? Right, so this is Hebrew. There's some Hebrew words here in this Yiddish newspaper, and it's a quote from Genesis. So it says Hakol, yes, Jacob and Esau. So this is a quote directly from the Torah, from Jacob and Esau. It says Hakol kol Coolidge hayadayim yedei business. So in the original, this is the voice of Jacob, but the hands of Esau. And here, this is the hands of business and the voice of Coolidge. So it's critiquing this relationship between Coolidge and the business community by saying Coolidge is just doing whatever business wants and not making decisions that are like best for the working man. So that's how the Freiheit took that. And again, of course, it's really interesting that even though it's a secular communist newspaper, they can quote, the Torah, and they know very confidently that everyone knows what they're talking about. So the last thing I put in your package is simply just some pictures from the Yiddish press of Coolidge in Northampton, because I thought it was really sweet. This is a famous picture of Coolidge at his house on Massasoit when he comes back after the end of his term. And we don't get that many references to Northampton in the Yiddish press overall, and I thought that this was a really nice one that shows the way that there's this imagined community of Jews and Yiddish and political community that goes all the way from New York City to Northampton.
Right down the street. 21 Massasoit with the plaque on it, and then he moved shortly before his death to the beaches in this off of South Street. And there's a gate there and a little beaches sign in front of it. Well, thank you very much. So we're at 11:37. I want to make sure there's time for Q&A. Just raise your hand if you're going to have a question, so I know how much time I need to give to folks. Okay, I got a few. Okay, I just want to maybe ask one myself, and then we'll bring it over to everybody. I really love what you both did, and it really, I think, helped crystallize what I think is the main dichotomy or paradox of Coolidge. He's obviously, the general perception is that he's just very right-wing. Immigration Act is, extraordinarily harsh, had huge consequences for several decades. But as we've seen some of the other discussions we've had, he does defend the right of African Americans to run for higher office. He does sign the Native American Citizenship Act. And he does talk about, at times, immigration in a positive light, but in an assimilationist way. And this also, I think, we had this discussion with the Native American discussion. He was big on Native American assimilation, not so much about folks maintaining their customs. So there's a line in the speech at the Jewish Community Center where he says, "The Jewish community of the United States is not only the second most numerous in the world, but in respect of its old world origins, it's probably the most cosmopolitan. But whatever their origin as a people, they've always come to us eager to adapt themselves to our institutions, to thrive under the influence of liberty, to take their full part as citizens in building and sustaining the nation, and to bear their part in its defense in order to make a contribution to the national life fully worthy of the traditions that they inherited. Now, he says this about a year after signing that immigration bill. And I think both of you touch upon this. There, I think, a perception that an Eastern European Jew is probably socialist and not assimilating to America's capitalist ways. And he's not dwelling on that here. He's talking about the other side of the ledger. But I just wonder what you two think about that dichotomy and how, what you think the average Jewish person might have thought about this speech in contemporaneously. I can step away from the mic.
I mean, it's true that a lot of Jews were socialists at this time. And I think that there's an interesting dichotomy, because we're talking about this moment where like the Yiddish press is this huge vehicle for the Jewish immigrant population in New York, but obviously in large part due to immigration quotas, after the mid-1920s, this drops dramatically. And that there is much more pressure to assimilate when there aren't newer generations of immigrants coming in. If you feel like you're the last generation whose family is Yiddish speaking, and that everyone around you is learning English and trying to become more a part of what they consider the more normative fabric of American life, then that's a dynamic that definitely that shifts American Jewish life at the same time as people are worried about the rise of the Klan and of rising anti-Semitism. And so it definitely shades that sense of what is possible in terms of having a dynamic Jewish community that could be multilingual or have a lot of different political perspectives.
You know, Coolidge was living at a complicated moment in American politics, and he had a complicated constituency, if you know the political history of the era. When Bill invited me, I looked up, because, you know, in the election of 1924, how Jews voted. And majority of Jews voted Democratic, but not in the numbers that were going to exist in the Roosevelt years. And what I suspected mapped onto was, in terms of the electoral history of the United States and the political history, that in this period in the 20s, what was happening is the Republicans, who had really been in ascendancy, right, for a long time. Woodrow Wilson, if you know American politics, was a Democrat, but Wilson only won office in 1912 because the Republican Party split, okay? What was happening in the 20s is Democrats were increasingly becoming the party of urban dwellers, right? So by 1928, the Democrats win, even though it's a blowout against the Democratic candidate, Al Smith, who's Catholic, the Democrats win every major city in the country, okay, in 1928. So in 1924, Jews in major urban areas were voting Democratic, but Jews in less urban areas were voting Republican. So I would suspect, although I don't know, but I would guess, and Panita might know, that whether Jews in this part of the country, in Western Mass, probably voted Republican, not Democrat in 1924.
Very small Jewish population.
Right, very small, which also, I think, reflects that. But in terms of Coolidge himself, you know, the Republican Party in the 1920s was a complicated constituency, and he was, I think, walking a careful line. For, as Bill was saying about African Americans, you know, those African Americans who could vote, which meant the small African American population in the North, voted Republican until 1936, right? because the Democratic Party was the party of the Ku Klux Klan, the party of the solid Democratic South and segregation. The Republican Party is the party of Lincoln. It's only, and by the way, just because it's an interest, since we're on this, if you look at Roosevelt's four elections, 32, 36, 40, and 44, there are only two groups that Roosevelt's support goes up every time he runs, Jews and African Americans, right? By 1920, over 90% of Jews, over 90% of African Americans who vote Democratic, okay? By 1944. But 1924, that's not the case yet. Plus, in terms of just immigration, Teddy Roosevelt, who Bill also mentioned, who was a eugenicist himself, Roosevelt,
wasn't.
Well, Teddy Roosevelt was, and Teddy Roosevelt was, accused American white Anglo-Saxon Protestant women of committing race suicide because they weren't having enough children, right? So we were being outnumbered by these immigrants coming in from Eastern Europe and Southern Europe. But at the same time he did that, he built a constituency around the Republican Party that was inclusive of white ethnics, including Jews and others, right? I'll just stop here, but there's a really interesting article by a guy, chapter in a book by Gary Nash, I think, where he looks at Theodore Roosevelt and how he told the story of the Battle of San Juan Hill, with the Rough Riders and the Spanish-American War. In the actual history of the battle, African-American troops, there was a segregated army at that point, but an African-American military unit actually played an instrumental part in the battle and in Roosevelt's victory. And when he first starts telling the story, right, he includes them. But over time, they fall out, and what it turns into is a story about, the Rough Riders, they included ex-Confederates and ex-Union people, and they included Irish and Jews and Italians and WASPs and this and that. So he builds this constituency that's inclusive of white ethnics that Coolidge inherits. So I think Coolidge was trying to balance all these forces as he was operating, which you can't blame him for. He's a politician. That's what he's supposed to do. So.
Excellent. So should I pass the mic around?
But just explain, you don't have to talk into the mic, you just have to hold it because it's for the mic.
Okay.
You have to speak loud for people.
Okay.
Yes. Did Coolidge have any Jewish friends in Northampton? And were they from families that came before 1890 or families after 1890?
Maybe someone else here can answer the Northampton question a little better, but I do know there's an article called Calvin Coolidge and the Jews that was published in the Jewish press, and we have a Calvin Coolidge and civil rights page on the Coolidge Library website that links to some of these things. And he said, he actually says in the beginning, Coolidge had little general contact with Jews. He did have personal relations with a handful of Jews, including Adolph Ox, owner and publisher of the New York Times, Lewis Marshall, a prominent attorney and founder of the American Jewish Committee, Eugene Isaac Meyer, whom he appointed to clean up the Federal Loan Board, which had been racked with scandal, and investment banker and mining mogul Adolph Lewison. So there's no mention, at least in this article, of Northampton relationships. But I don't know if anyone else has more local knowledge than I do.
I just want to say in 1890 there were 3 Jewish families in Northampton, and they were all Eastern European.
Okay. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
So it's been said that the early wave of Jewish immigration wasn't thrilled with the later wave coming from the Eastern European that was in the early 20th century. Can you say anything about the role of the early wave of the Jewish immigration toward the 24 quota bill? Were they in support? Were they against? Did they have any role at all to play? What were their attitudes towards the 24 quota bill?
The attitudes of which group?
The early group from the Western European wave versus the Eastern European wave that came after.
I mean, I can't speak knowledgeably with that one constituency. I think as a general matter, it wasn't that controversial a bill. You know, you're coming off of World War I, Communist Revolution, the Palmer raids, Red Scare, Wall Street bombing by Italian anarchists in 1920. Go back farther, you know, a Polish immigrant, Polish American, murders William McKinley. So there's a lot of animus nationally to socialist anarchists, which is tied to Eastern European. So I can't speak to directly what, you know, you sort of see other dynamics where, you know, fifth generation immigrants don't have the same political views as the first generation. So it wouldn't shock me if they were leaning towards the more conservative side of things. But I think as a general matter, the opposition to the bill in 24 was pretty localized to these urban areas and was not really otherwise that controversial a bill at the time. Oh, let me bring this to you then. Rob Weir, illustrious member of the Coolidge Presidential Library Museum Standing Committee.
Yeah, that's a great question you asked. And if you look at the early wave of Jews, a lot of them were Germans, and they were so-called 48ers. That is, they were part of the social revolution of 1848, and they were all socialists, pretty much. The second wave of Jews also comes from Western Europe in the 1870s and 1880s. A lot of them are Germans, but they are more conservative. So when you get the backlash coming in the 20s against labor unions, those are all children of, you know, red diaper babies, essentially, as we later call them. They're more radical. So that's part and parcel of the crackdown on radical ideas in the 20s. So what you're seeing is a lack of emphasis on class and an emerging emphasis on, but emergency, I'm trying to say, you see a less of an emphasis on ethnicity and an emergent emphasis on social class. So those ones who come in the 1870s are part of that social revolution wave that takes place in Germany and spills out. And Germany's big because, you know, it's the old, an older form of feudalism that becomes state nationalism and so forth. But that's what's happening at this period of time. So the person who said that, or I think it was Bill who read about the, where the a kind of emphasis on, no, somebody over here said, emphasis on just the upper class. Yeah, yes.
You know, there's a complicated relationship between the, within the Jewish community in this period that, you know, sometimes it gets simplified into just, you know, hostility or simple stories. It's an old book, but I still think it's a great book. It's by Arthur Gorin, I think, if I remember the author right. It's called The Kehillah Experiment. He taught at Hebrew University for a long time, American Jewish history. But it centers on New York City in the early 20th century, and it also features Judah Magnus. This is in pre-World War I America, who is very famous. He becomes the first chancellor of Hebrew University in Jerusalem after World War I, and is kind of the largest, most significant advocate of a binationalist solution in Palestine in the pre-1948 period. I think it's 1910, the police commissioner of New York, don't quote me on the date, makes some statement about how some huge percentage of the crime in New York is committed by Jews, right? The American ancestors of that earlier Jewish immigration, like the Sulzbergers and others, right? They get together and they force the police commissioner to make an apology, right? But they also meet privately and they kind of go, well, you know, he's kind of right. And like, you know, they have their own sort of negative view of that East European community. But their response to that is actually to try to form a complicated community organization that both sort of policed the Lower East Side, but also provided social services to the Lower East Side. And they had to look for the right person to run this, and they picked Magnus, who's actually a product of that Central European Jewish immigration, but who had great relationships with the Jews of coming from Eastern Europe. So the relationship is really kind of complicated, and it changes over time. And there is a definite class element. Yeah.
I thought I saw women with hands up before. All right. You need.
Well, I'm a graduate of Bill's presidential book discussion group, and I'm very grateful for that. And as I remember it, his predecessor, Calvin Coolidge's predecessor, I forget who it was. Hardy, yeah. He was sort of almost a Trump. He had all sorts of bad he was a dirty guy. I mean, he was a dirty politician. And one of the things that Coolidge had to do was reestablish trust in the presidency. And the fact that these Jewish people could feel comfortable addressing him in the newspaper, that seems to me to say he was successful in that. I mean, he was so squeaky clean, as I remember it, from Vermont. And
What clean up teapot?
yeah, the Teapot Dome scandal. And also, he had friends of his playing poker in the White House.
Harding.
Yeah, Harding. And it really was a job to reestablish credibility in the presidency. And it seems like Calvin Coolidge was the man for the job. And the fact that people could address him in the newspaper seems to be supportive of that.
I would defer to the panelists as far as what you think the Jewish community felt about him in that way. Certainly, I think Coolidge was a popular figure at the time, but how much it extended, outside of more socialistic urban Jews, otherwise, if you feel like you have a sense of, was there a good relationship there?
I don't think that there was that much of a relationship. I mean, again, we're talking in a context of 90% of American Jews voting for FDR. Like they didn't have, outside of this kind of humorous take on Coolidge as the sort of father figure for America. I don't think that they had a strong sense of him as a person. But I mean, I just checking over the various biographies that have been written about him, I think it's easy to say that maybe not a lot of people had a strong sense of Coolidge as a person. Maybe he kept that internal. So I think he didn't really capture people's imaginations necessarily. It's certainly not in the Jewish community. But I think you're right in that he was seen as someone who, was steering the ship in a strong presidential authority kind of way, unlike his predecessor.
I don't know if this relates to Calvin Coolidge or not, but I grew up as a teenager knowing that the melting pot was a good thing. And I wondered sort of what administration, that whole notion that we were this one big pot that needed to come together and become this beautiful new entity that left behind smelly food and different clothing and all of that. And is that something that happened in Coolidge's era, or is that something that happened before him?
Well, certainly I remember reading about, in this time period, slightly before, Henry Ford would stage these pageants for his workers when...
Move over to the mic. We don't have to hold them.
I remember reading about Henry Ford holding these pageants for his workers where they would all stand up in their native costumes and literally jump into a pot and take off their native costumes and put on regular clothes and jump back out again. So I mean there was a literal sense of, yes, you must throw away all of your trappings of your former identity and become American. As to whether or not that actually happened, I mean, again, I think it has a lot to do with these demographics of urban versus rural and whether or not one found oneself in a strong ethnic community. And there was certainly, there's a strong class component here. And there were so many strong ethnic working class workers associations throughout the 1920s. They really tend to pick up a lot of membership at this time period, and well into the 1930s and 40s, even after the war, there was this sense among the ethnic working class, and especially among Jews, that there was this class, ethnic, racial component. That the capitalists were the ones that were telling you you had to literally take off your, dirndls or whatever, and become American, and that you should be suspicious of that, and you should push back on it, because why are they asking you to do that? And this is the era of all these mass industrial strikes, and there were all of these industrialists who were hiring all these different groups of workers. So they would hire, like in the Lawrence strike in 1912, right? They hired Syrians and Greeks and Jews and all these different groups because they thought that surely they wouldn't talk to each other if they didn't speak the same language. And so it was up to the union organizers to come in and say, actually, we all do speak one language, and it's the language of unity among the working class. And so there were many different ways that there was this, demographically in big cities where there are these strong urban communities, and then in these industrial towns where ethnic working class people held on to those ethnic identities and languages well into the post-war era, because it was seen as part of their identity as a working class person.
One other footnote I might add, which is not related to Jewish community, but Native American. You might have seen the picture of Calvin Coolidge wearing the Native American headdress. We have the headdress at the Coolidge Museum, although we can't show it for legal reasons right now. That was a gift made to him because he signed the Indian Citizenship Act. They were thanking him for it, even though this actually was divided the Native American community, because not all of them, some of them saw it as assimilationist, and they didn't want to embrace that. The first person of color vice president is not Kamala Harris. It's Charles Curtis, who was elected in 1928, who was Native American. But he was not someone who wore traditional Native American attire. He was suit and tie. And that was promoted as someone who had showing the assimilation. So that notion of assimilation being something to embrace and to celebrate, that's how far it went in the 1920s. But we've totally memory holded it. We realize that we've elected a Native American vice president before. I saw a hand over, yes.
Bill, I'm sure you can answer this question. The Immigration Act from 1924 was very much focused on the Asians who were coming here and literally closed them out.
Japanese specifically.
Yes. Is that not true?
Well, so this was the part of the bill that Coolidge hated and made him. He did sign it, but it's the one they made him pause about it. He really didn't pause about anything else. But he felt that we had a good diplomatic relationship with Japan, and this was going to damage that because it was specific to them and closing and shutting them out. And so, in his signing statement, Coolidge makes a remark saying that he doesn't support this part of it, but he does go ahead and sign it. And certainly, it's not like Japanese-American relations didn't get any better from 1924 to 1944. And that, I believe, was a factor in that. But yes, that was a factor. But I do think also the Eastern European factor was also, on the Pacific side, Asian migration was something that was rattled America, and that goes back to the late 19th century with the Chinese Exclusion Act. We just talked about this in the book club with Chester Arthur. We talked about the letter, the personal letter that Coolidge had symbolically. Chester Arthur had a literal pen pal named Julius Sands, who lived in New York City, and like Chester Arthur, but was more progressive in using modern language. And Arthur first vetoes the Chinese Exclusion Act. She writes him a letter praising him for it, and then he turns around a month later and signs a slightly modified version of it. And that's the first immigration exclusionary bill that is in American law. And then Julius Sands rips him a new one after that. But that's the trajectory that the country goes on, starting there in the late 19th century, extends with the 1924 Act on both the Asian side and the Eastern European side.
The only difference is that And that's all right, but that immigration from Japan had already been sharply lowered by the 1910 Gentleman's Agreement, where the Japanese government agreed to limit immigration to avoid the embarrassment of a bill.
Mhm.
The immigration from Eastern Europe and Southern Europe was genuine and large, and World War I slowed it down. There was a 1921 bill that was kind of a precursor to this, but the 24 bill really slams the door shut.
We're almost at noon. Maybe we got time for one, maybe two? Please. This is for the live stream purposes.
Do I talk into it?
Just that's fine. That's fine.
Okay. When Coolidge, getting back to Coolidge and immigration, when Coolidge signed that bill in 1924, because he did that, he's often been, it's sort of marked him in many circles as a person of prejudice. But given the fact that that eugenics movement was so powerful and in very important circles, these people were not considered crackpots, both in England and in the United States. This was a powerful movement that had a lot of respect. And you combine that with what we've talked about today, the fear of radicalism, including the anarchists from Italy, and apparently the radicals, many of whom were Jewish, from Eastern Europe. And I've often wondered, that Coolidge was kind of a victim of these forces and was kind of like almost a cipher when it came to this, and just said, what can I do? And I've often thought that anybody who was president in 1924 at that juncture, that perfect storm, would have said, I guess I'm going to sign it. Don't you think it would have been overwhelmingly, what's the word, a veto?
Oh, yeah, I agree.
Yeah, overridden, yeah. So
No, I agree.
That's just a perspective I have on Coolidge in 1924.
Yeah, this wasn't a close call, Bill. Whether you exonerate Coolidge for that, or you still blame him for signing the bill, that's personal opinion. I wouldn't say he was a driver of the process, but I think he was very much in the mainstream of American political opinion at the time.
Yeah, I agree completely.
Last question before we close it down. Thank you, CBI. Thank you to our panelists. This is fantastic. Please check out the Coolidge Museum. Please donate to our renovation. And please check out the book club on Monday or in future months.